The practice room was her kingdom. It was small, smelled faintly of old wood and dust, and the light from the single window was usually gray, but inside it, she was in control. The piano, a well-worn but lovingly maintained upright, was her only subject. Here, for a few hours each day, the world made sense. Her fingers would find the patterns in the chaos of a complex sonata, solving problems one measure at a time. The music on the stand demanded something, and she would give it perfectly. Outside that room, she was a ghost. A pleasant, useful ghost, but a ghost nonetheless. At the big, bustling music school where she worked, they knew her as the pianist who could sight-read anything, the one who never complained, the one who was always available. If a student needed an accompanist for a last-minute jury, they called her. If a visiting professor required someone to play through a new, fiendishly difficult composition, they emailed her. She was the piece of the machine you never thought about until it wasn't there. She didn't mind it, most of the time. Or at least, that's what she told herself. The work was steady. It paid the rent on her small apartment, which was really just a place to sleep between sessions at the piano. She loved music, truly loved it, in a way that was quiet and deep and personal. The flashy students, the ones with big dreams and bigger personalities, they loved the applause. She loved the moment before the first note, when anything was possible. She loved the physics of it, the hammers hitting the strings, the vibration traveling through the floor and into her bones. That was enough. It had to be. Her official title was assistant instructor and repertoire pianist, which sounded important on paper. In reality, it meant she did the jobs no one else wanted. She spent Wednesday afternoons in a stuffy classroom, playing simple scales for a class of 8-year-olds who kicked the legs of their chairs. She organized a library of sheet music, a chaotic mess of coffee-stained pages and forgotten masterworks. And for the past 10 years, she had been the silent, reliable backbone of the school's annual gala concert. The gala was the biggest night of the year. Important people came, donors with deep pockets, critics from the newspapers, former students who are now famous. It was where the school showed off its best and brightest. The prodigy violinist, the tenor with the golden voice, the conductor who was barely out of his teens, but already had a recording contract. They shone under the hot lights. She, for her part, had always been in the shadows. One year, she turned pages for a visiting cellist. Another year, she played the celesta part in an orchestra piece, a tiny tinkling sound lost in a sea of brass and strings. She was part of the scenery, a functional element, like a stage light or a music stand. A week before this year's gala, a summons came. An email from the director's assistant, brief and to the point. Please see the director in his office at 4 p.m. A flicker of something, not hope, exactly, but curiosity passed through her. In 10 years, he had never requested to see her personally. The director's office was a different world from her practice room. It was large, paneled in dark wood, and smelled of leather and expensive air freshener. Awards and photos covered the walls, the director shaking hands with famous musicians, the director accepting checks, the director looking solemn and artistic. He was a tall man who had been a celebrated conductor in his youth, and he carried himself as if he was still on the podium. Aware that every eye was on him, he didn't look up from his computer when she entered, just gestured vaguely to the chair opposite his massive desk. She sat, her hands folded in her lap, waiting. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. Finally, he looked up. "Ah, good. The gala," he began, as if they were in the middle of a conversation. "We have a logistical issue. A gap. After the soprano's aria, before the cello concerto, the stage crew needs 3 minutes, maybe 4, to reset. The cello needs a different riser, different microphone placement. You understand?" She nodded. She understood logistics. It was most of her job. We can't have dead air. The donors get restless. They start talking, and then you can't get them to stop. So we need a little filler. Something pleasant, undemanding. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a single sheet of music, sliding it across the polished desk towards her. This will do. She leaned forward and picked it up. The paper was crisp. The title at the top read Souvenir d'Automne in an elegant, flowing font. A memory of autumn. She scanned the lines. It was, as he said, undemanding. A simple lyrical melody in the right hand, supported by basic, predictable chords in the left. No complex rhythms, no dramatic key changes, no technically challenging runs. It was the kind of piece a competent student might play at a middle school recital. It was, in every sense of the word, nice. Just something in the background, the director continued, his eyes already drifting back to his computer screen. While people are finding their seats again, maybe getting a last drink from the lobby. Pleasant, quiet. Think of it as musical wallpaper. He finally looked directly at her, and his expression was not unkind, but it was utterly devoid of any expectation. Play it exactly as written. No need for interpretation. Just keep it simple and smooth. It's nothing special, but it will serve its purpose. The phrase hung in the air between them. Nothing special. It wasn't meant as an insult, she knew. It was a simple assessment of the task. The piece was nothing special. The moment was nothing special. And by extension, she was the right person for it, because she, too, was reliable, pleasant, and nothing special. A hot, sharp feeling rose in her chest, so unfamiliar she almost didn't recognize it. It was the ghost of a feeling she'd buried long ago, back when she was a girl and dreamed of playing on big stages. She pressed it down the way she always did. This was her job. This was her place. Of course, she said, her voice quiet but even. I understand. Good, he said, a note of finality in his voice. The meeting was over. The rehearsal schedule is with my assistant. You'll be slotted in for a 5-minute sound check on the night. That's all we'll need. She stood, the sheet of music feeling strangely heavy in her hand. Thank you, she said, not knowing what else to say. He gave a slight nod, already engrossed in something else. Thank you. It's good to have someone we can count on for these things. She walked out of the plush office, down the sterile hallway, and back into the familiar, dim corridor that led to the practice rooms. The sounds of the school swirled around her, a violinist practicing a screeching high note, a teacher yelling about tempo, the distant thunder of a percussionist. She unlocked the door to her small room and sat on the piano bench, placing the single sheet of music on the stand. Souvenir d'Automne, she whispered to the empty room. She played it through once, exactly as written. Her fingers, capable of navigating intricate fugues and blistering arpeggios, moved through the simple chords with effortless boredom. The melody was sweet, forgettable. It was, as promised, musical wallpaper. She stopped at the end and let the silence settle back in. The room felt colder than usual. The gray light from the window seemed to drain the color from everything. For the first time in a long time, the four walls of her kingdom felt less like a sanctuary and more like a very small, very quiet cage. She looked at her hands, resting on the keys that could speak 1,000 languages, and then at the simplistic notes on the stand. A deep, weary sigh escaped her. This was her role, to be the utility player, the reliable one, the one for things that were nothing special. But as she sat there in the growing dusk, a stubborn little thought, no more than a whisper, stirred in the back of her mind. It was about the phrase, nothing special, and it was about what might happen if, just once, no one was watching, she decided to listen to it differently. The sheet of music sat on her kitchen table for 2 days. Every time she passed it, the title seemed to mock her a little. Souvenir d'automne, a memory of autumn. It sounded like the name of a cheap perfume. She made tea. She graded simple. Theory assignments from her young students. She tried to read a book. But the single crisp page was always in the corner of her eye. She was angry, but not at the director. She was angry at herself. Why did his simple, practical instructions feel like a small death? He hadn't been cruel. He'd given her a job, the same as always. It was her own fault for feeling that tiny, stupid spark of something when she was called to his office. What had she expected? An invitation to perform the grand piano concerto? That wasn't her life. Her life was this quiet apartment, the familiar walk to the school, the reliable paycheck. There was dignity in that. There had to be. On the third evening, with the gala now just 4 days away, she knew she had to practice it. If it was going to be background music, it had to be flawless background music. Smooth, uninterrupted, invisible. She needed to make her fingers forget their strength and learn to be soft and forgettable. She went to the school late, when the halls were mostly empty, and the cacophony of daytime practice had died down to a few lonely, persistent sounds. Her practice room welcomed her with its usual dusty silence. She put the sheet on the stand, sat down, and placed her hands over the keys. She took a deep breath, intending to play it mechanically from start to finish, and then do it again 50 times until it was pure muscle memory, devoid of any feeling at all. The first chord was simple, a minor chord, gentle and a little sad. Her foot pressed the sustain pedal, letting the sound hang in the air, and as it faded, something unexpected happened. The sound didn't just disappear. It seemed to blend with the quiet of the room, with the faint hum of the overhead light, and it became a color. A grayish-brown, like the bare branches of a tree outside her childhood window in November. She shook her head. Nonsense. She played the first phrase of the melody. It was a simple, falling line. It wasn't supposed to be anything. But her fingers, trained for decades to listen and feel, heard a question in it. The notes asked something. They sounded lonely. She stopped. This was ridiculous. She was interpreting exactly what she was told not to do. She was supposed to be a player piano, not a storyteller. She started again, forcing herself to play lighter, faster, more like the tinkling of a music box. It sounded empty. Worse than empty, it sounded dead. It was the musical equivalent of a painted smile. Her hands fell from the keys into her lap. She stared at the notes, those innocent black dots on lines. What was in them? For the first time, she didn't look at them as instructions, but as a landscape. She let her eyes wander over the page without trying to play. The melody was simple, yes, but it had a space to it. There were rests, moments of silence between the phrases. The left-hand chords changed slowly, like a slow turn of the head. It wasn't a complex piece, but it was. Spacious. There was room inside it. Tentatively, she played the first 4 bars again. This time, she didn't fight the feeling that came. She let the minor chord be sad. She let the melody feel lonely. She played it not as a pianist trying to be perfect, but as a person simply touching the keys. The sound changed. It was no longer just notes from a page. It was a sound from the room, from her. A memory, sharp and clear, surfaced. She was maybe 7 years old, in her grandparents' house. The air was cold, the kind that smells of damp leaves and coal smoke. Her grandmother was in the kitchen, humming an old tune while she rolled dough. That same gray-brown light filled the small living room where the old, out-of-tune piano sat. She had played a simple song from her beginner book, and her grandmother, wiping floury hands on her apron, had come to the doorway and smiled. "Pretty," she had said. So pretty. It wasn't a great compliment, but it was real. It was warm. Her fingers found the next phrase of Souvenir d'Automne. The melody rose a little, as if looking up. She thought of that smile, that fleeting moment of being heard, even for just a few notes. She let the phrase lift, just a hair, with a fragile hope. She kept going. Without changing a single written note, she began to listen to the story between the notes. The quiet middle section, where the left hand played a repeating rocking pattern, became the rhythm of the train that would pass behind. Her old school, a sound of longing for a world somewhere else. A slightly brighter major chord that appeared for just a moment was the surprise of a single golden leaf on a gray sidewalk, beautiful and doomed. She wasn't making it up. The feelings were there, buried in the spaces the composer had left. She was just the first person to truly listen to them. Everyone else, including probably the composer himself, saw this as a simple trifle. She saw a diary written in code. The piece was no longer about autumn leaves or picturesque nostalgia. It became a map of her own quiet life. The main melody was her own constant, slightly lonely thread. The supporting chords were the rhythm of her days, the walk to work, the sorting of music, the pouring of tea. The moments of slight dissonance were the unspoken frustrations, the swallowed words, the dreams filed neatly away. The final resolving chord was the acceptance she felt every night before sleep, the settling back into being no one special. She played it through like that, just once. She didn't think about technique. She didn't think about the gala or the director. She just let her hands speak the translation of this simple piece into the language of her heart. When the last note faded, the room felt different. The air was charged. Her eyes were wet. She looked at her hands, trembling slightly on the keys. A shock went through her. What had she done? She had been told to play it as written, without interpretation. She had just discovered a universe inside it. She had connected it to her own life, her own memories. That was the deepest kind of interpretation there was. For a moment, panic set in. She couldn't play it like this at the gala. It would be all wrong. It would be noticeable. It would be special. She was supposed to be part of the scenery, and she had just painted a heartbreaking self-portrait onto a simple piece of wallpaper. She played it again, this time trying to force it back into its box, to make it bland and pleasant. It was impossible. Now that she had heard the ghost in the notes, she couldn't unhear it. The bland version felt like a lie, a violence against the music and against herself. She sat in the silent room for a long time. The choice was clear, and it was terrifying. She could do her job. She could play the piece as the director wanted, pleasant, quiet, forgettable. She would be the reliable utility player once more. No one would be upset. No one would even remember it. She could play the piece as she now understood it. She could play the memory of her grandmother's kitchen. She could play the gray light and the longing and the quiet beauty of a life spent in service to music. She would be playing her own story, disguised as a simple souvenir d'automne. It would be an act of incredible honesty and of incredible risk. It might break the spell of silence that had surrounded her for 10 years. Or it might just confirm to everyone that she was odd, too emotional, not a team player. She packed her bag slowly, her mind racing. As she turned off the light and closed the door to the practice room, she didn't know what she would do, but she knew one thing for certain. The piece was no longer nothing special. It had become a secret, and she was the only one who knew it. The weight of that secret felt heavier than any expectation, and more thrilling than any applause she had ever imagined. The day of the gala arrived wrapped in a cold, drizzling rain. It felt appropriate. The whole city seemed to be holding its breath under a gray blanket. Inside her small apartment, the day passed with a strange, slow-motion quality. Ordinary tasks took on a sharp focus. The click of the kettle, the pattern of the rain on the window, The feel of the fabric of her simple black dress. It all seemed incredibly loud and detailed. She had not decided. That was the terrifying truth. All through the quiet morning, as she slowly got ready, the two choices warred inside her. One voice, practical and worn out, repeated the director's words like a mantra. Pleasant, quiet, background, nothing special. It told her to be professional, to do the job she was paid for, to not make a fuss. That voice promised safety. It promised that tomorrow would be exactly like yesterday, and there was a deep, tired comfort in that. The other voice was just a feeling. It had no words. It was the memory of the sound in the practice room, the charged air when she played the piece as her own. It was the ghost of her grandmother's smile. It was a quiet, stubborn hum in her chest that refused to be silenced. This voice promised nothing except the chance, however small, to be truly heard for 3 minutes. She arrived at the grand concert hall hours early, as instructed. The backstage area was a universe away from her quiet practice room. It was a chaotic hive of tense energy. Roadies in black shirts pushed giant flight cases on squealing wheels. A young flautist stood in a corner, playing the same frantic run over and over, her face pale. A famous baritone was arguing with a sound technician about his microphone levels. The air smelled of coffee, floor polish, and nervous sweat. She found her assigned corner a folding chair next to a stack of equipment cases, far from the dressing rooms of the stars. This was her place. She sat, her small handbag on her lap, and watched the storm of preparation swirl around her. She was invisible. A stagehand nearly tripped over her feet, muttering an apology without even looking at her face. Her 5-minute stage rehearsal slot came. She walked onto the vast, empty stage. The hall was a dark cavern, 1,000 empty red velvet seats staring back. The main concert piano, a magnificent, glossy black grand, stood center stage like a sleeping beast. Her piano for the interlude was a smaller, simpler instrument, positioned off to the side, partly hidden by the curve of the grand. A symbol, she thought, not the main event. A bored-looking technician with a headset gave her a thumbs up from the shadowy wings. "You're just a filler, right? Souvenir thing? Go ahead, let's check levels." She sat at the piano. The bench felt different. The keys felt colder, harder. She placed her hands on them and played the first line of the piece, her version, the one full of feeling. It sounded thin and small in the enormous space, swallowed by the darkness. "Okay, good, we got it," the technician called out, cutting her off after just 10 seconds. "You're fine. Next." And that was it. Her preparation. She was just a level to be checked, a box to be ticked. She walked back to her corner, the knot in her stomach tightening. As the evening began, the donors and patrons arrived. She could hear the change in the air backstage, a rising wave of chatter, laughter, the clink of wine glasses from the lobby seeping through the heavy doors. The atmosphere behind the curtain grew even more charged. The performers, now in their elegant outfits, had a glazed, focused look. The director moved through the chaos, smiling his public smile, pressing shoulders, a general sending his troops into battle. The concert began. The roar of the audience dimmed to a respectful silence, then erupted in applause for the first performer, a young violinist with flying fingers. She watched from the wings, standing in the dark. The violinist played with fiery passion, and the audience loved it. They applauded with a warm, predictable enthusiasm. Then came the soprano, her voice soaring to the rafters with dramatic arias. More applause, a little louder. She watched the people in the front rows. She could see them clearly in the stage lights. Older couples, wealthy patrons, critics with sharp eyes and folded arms. They listened, they nodded, they clapped at the right moments. But she also saw the glances at watches, the subtle shifting in seats, the quiet whispers behind a program. They were being entertained, but they were not being touched. Not really. It was all impressive, and it was all happening at a safe distance. A strange calm began to settle over her, cutting through the nervousness. It wasn't the calm of peace, but the calm of a decision finally made. She looked at these people, waiting to be impressed, and she looked at the small, sidelined piano. She thought of the ghost in the notes, the story she had found. That story wasn't impressive. It wasn't fiery or dramatic. It was quiet and real and human. It was about gray light and small memories and silent years. They had asked for background. They had asked for wallpaper. But what if, just for 3 minutes, the wallpaper could speak? What if it could tell the story of every person who ever felt overlooked, who ever had a dream that didn't shine brightly enough for the big stage? It wasn't about defiance. It wasn't about showing up the director or proving herself. That fiery feeling was gone. What remained was a simple, clear understanding. She could not play the piece as a lie. To play it empty, just to be pleasant, would be a betrayal of the music, of the ghost in it, and of the quiet person she had been for all these years. She had to play it as she heard it. Whatever happened next would happen. The soprano took her final, glittering high note. The hall exploded in applause. As the singer bowed, the stage manager started his frantic, whispered choreography. Crew members in black swarmed the stage in the half-darkness, moving the soprano's podium, rolling out the riser and stand for the cellist. The director appeared at her side in the wings. He didn't look at her. He was watching the stage crew, his eyes sharp. He spoke out of the corner of his mouth. "Okay, go. Remember, smooth and quiet. Just fill the space. Nothing to distract from the changeover." He gave her a gentle, almost absent-minded push towards the stage. It was the same way one might switch on a light. A functional gesture. She walked out. The applause for the soprano was dying down. The audience was in motion, some standing to stretch, others whispering, a few getting up to head to the lobby. The sound of shuffling programs and creaking seats filled the hall. The stage was a mess of moving shadows and busy crew. No one looked at her. She reached the small piano. She adjusted the bench, a small, familiar ritual. She smoothed the single page of music on the stand, though she didn't need it. She could play the notes in her sleep, but she needed to see the title. Souvenir d'Army. A memory. She placed her hands on the keys. They were still cold. She took a slow, deep breath, not the breath of a performer, but the breath of someone about to speak a difficult, important truth for the first time. She could still hear the audience murmuring. She could see from the corner of her eye a man in the third row leaning over to say something to his wife, a smirk on his face. This was it. The moment for background. The moment for nothing special. She closed her eyes. She shut out the grand hall, the shuffling crowd, the impatient director in the wings, the busy crew. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she saw the gray light of her practice room. She felt the ghost in the notes stir, and she began to play. Not for them, for the memory. For the ghost. For herself. The first notes were wrong. That was the immediate, panicked thought that flashed in the mind of the director, standing in the wings. He had told her quiet, pleasant background. This was not that. The sound she drew from the piano wasn't loud, but it was present. It didn't tinkle. It didn't politely decorate the air. It spoke. The opening minor chord hung in the hall, not as a sweet sound, but as a color, a deep, sorrowful gray, the color of a late afternoon when the light gives up. She held it a fraction too long, letting its sadness resonate in the suddenly quieting space. Then the melody began. It was the same simple melody from the page, but it was no longer simple. It was a voice, quiet and clear, telling a story of absence. Each note seemed weighed down with a gentle, patient grief. In the third row, the man who had been smirking stopped mid-sentence. His wife's hand, which had been reaching for her purse, stilled. They both turned their heads, not with a jerk, but slowly, as if pulled by a thread. The chatter in the hall, which had been a low rumble of a dozen conversations, began to fray at the edges. A woman laughing near the back caught her laugh and swallowed it. The sound died in her throat. She played on, her eyes still closed. She was not in the concert hall. She was in her grandmother's kitchen. The left hand began its gentle, rocking rhythm. To the director, it was supposed to be a basic accompaniment. To the audience now, it became something else, the steady, comforting beat of a heart, or the slow creak of a rocking chair on an old porch. It was the sound of waiting, of time passing quietly. A stagehand, who had been hefting a heavy speaker cabinet onto the new riser, froze. He was supposed to keep working, to finish the change in the 4-minute window. But his arms lost their strength. He set the speaker down without a sound and straightened up, looking at the woman at the small piano. He didn't know music. He worked concerts for the paycheck. But he knew feeling. And what was flowing from that piano was a feeling so raw and true, it felt private, like he was eavesdropping on a prayer. The melody rose, just a little. A shift from a gray memory to a memory with a sliver of gold in it. The pianist's fingers, which usually moved with efficient precision, now seemed to be feeling their way, caressing the keys rather than striking them. The phrase lifted with a fragile, aching hope. In the audience, an older man felt his breath catch. He didn't know why. The music had just touched a memory of his own long-forgotten morning, a specific kind of sunlight through a window of a house he hadn't thought of in 40 years. His eyes, without his permission, filled with tears. The hall was utterly silent now. Not the silence of politeness, but the silence of absorption. The air itself seemed to have thickened, to have become a part of the music. No one coughed. No one rustled a program. Every person was turned inward, listening not just with their ears, but with the parts of themselves that remembered loneliness and small joys and quiet love. She reached the middle section, where the right hand played a series of single, questioning notes over the steady left hand. In the score, it was just a bridge. Under her fingers, each note became a word in a sentence she had never spoken aloud. Asterisk, is this all there is? One note asked. Remember this, said the next. It was beautiful too, answered the third. The spaces between the notes, the silences she now understood, were full of meaning. They were the unsaid things, the years of being in the background, the peace she had made with it, and the quiet ache that never fully left. A young music student, sitting in the cheap seats at the very back, found she had stopped breathing. She had come to hear the famous cellist. She had barely noticed the announcement about an interlude. This was not an interlude. This was the main event. This was what music was for. It wasn't about impressing her. It was about finding her. She felt seen by a complete stranger in a black dress, in a way she never had been. On stage, the crew stood like statues. Their job was forgotten. The changeover was incomplete. The cello's riser was only half set. The microphone stand lay on its side. No one moved. The stage manager, a usually gruff man with a stopwatch, made no signal. He just stood in the shadows, his arms crossed, his head bowed as if in respect. The piece began its return to the main theme. It was a return, but it was changed. The sorrow was still there, but it was now wrapped in a hard-won tenderness. It was the sound of accepting a life that wasn't a blaze of glory, but a steady, warm ember. It was beautiful, not despite its simplicity, but because of it. Because it was true. The final chords approached. She played them slowly, letting each one bloom and fade like a breath exhaled after holding it for a very long time. The last note was the softest of all, not a grand finale, but a gentle closing of a door. A goodbye, but a goodbye that held the memory close. Her hands lifted from the keys and settled back into her lap. The sound faded into the perfect velvet silence of the hall. For a long moment, nothing happened. There was no immediate applause. There was no movement at all. The silence was deeper and more profound than any sound. It was the silence of a spell, not yet broken, of a shared dream from which no one wanted to wake. People looked around, blinking, as if returning to their bodies from somewhere far away. They saw tears on their neighbors' cheeks and felt the wetness on their own dot in the wings. The director stood completely still. His professional mind, which should have been furious at the botched changeover, at the ignored instructions, was blank. All he could feel was a hollow ache in his chest and a stunning, disorienting sense of shame. He had called this nothing special. He had told her not to interpret. He had used her as a tool, a piece of scenery. And she had just shown him, and everyone in the hall, what real music was. It wasn't in the complexity of the notes. It was in the humanity poured through them. Then, from the middle of the hall, a single person stood up. It wasn't a rush. It was a slow, deliberate unfolding, like rising from a kneel. It was the older man who had remembered the sunlight. He did not clap. He simply stood, his hands at his sides, looking at the pianist with an expression of pure gratitude. It was like a signal. Another person stood. Then another. A wave of people rising to their feet, not in the explosive jump of excitement, but in the solemn, earned rise of deep respect. They were not applauding a performance. They were bearing witness to a truth that had been shared. Finally, the sound began. It started as a low rumble, like distant thunder, and built into a wave of applause that was raw and emotional. It wasn't the polite, practiced clapping from earlier in the evening. This was messy. Some people were still wiping their eyes. Others were just nodding, as if saying, "Yes, I understand." She sat at the piano, hearing the wave break over her. She opened her eyes, looking out at the sea of people standing for her. She felt no triumph. She felt a deep, trembling relief and a profound loneliness that had finally, after all these years, been heard. She placed one hand lightly on the piano, as if to steady herself or to thank the instrument, and gave one small, slow bow of her head. The applause went on. It wasn't the loudest the hall had ever heard, but it was the deepest. It had weight. It washed over her where she sat, a physical thing, warm and slightly overwhelming. She kept her head bowed for a long moment, not out of modesty, but because she needed to gather the pieces of herself. She had poured everything out onto those keys, and now she felt light, empty, and strangely fragile. When she finally looked up and rose from the bench, the standing audience seemed like a forest of quiet respect. She gave one more small, stiff nod, then turned and walked off the stage. The transition was jarring. From the roaring warmth of the hall into the cool, shadowy silence of the wings. The crew members, still standing frozen where the music had caught them, now looked at her. Their expressions weren't the blank professionalism from before. They were soft, almost awed. One of the older stagehands, a man with rough hands and a tired face, simply touched his forehead with 2 fingers in a tiny, silent salute as she passed. The director was waiting. He stood alone, away from the busy stage manager, who was now hissing urgent commands to get the cellist set up finished. For a long second, they just looked at each other. His face was unreadable, a mask of pure shock worn thin. The public smile was gone. The impatience was gone. He looked like a man who had just seen a fundamental law of his universe broken. He opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. I. He began, but no other words came. He shook his head, a tiny, bewildered motion. He wasn't angry. He was dismantled. He had been the curator of special, and he had just been shown irrevocably that he had no idea what the word meant. Finally, he just said, her name, the one she hadn't been given in this story, but he said it not as her boss, but as a fellow human being, stunned. Go, sit, we'll talk later. She walked past him, down the narrow corridor that led away from the stage. The sounds of the gala resumed behind her, the frantic final stage adjustments, the muffled announcement for the cellist, the settling of the audience back into their seats. But the energy was different. The air backstage had been charged with ambition and tension. Now it felt hushed, like after a storm. She didn't go to her isolated corner. She couldn't. She needed to be nowhere. She pushed open the heavy metal door that led to the fire escape, a stark, concrete landing open to the night. The cold, damp air hit her face, a relief. The drizzle had stopped, leaving the city lights smeared and shimmering on the wet streets below. She leaned against the railing, the cold metal seeping through the fabric of her dress, and let the trembling finally take over. It started in her hands and moved up her arms. She wasn't crying. It was a pure physical reaction, the aftermath of an emotional earthquake. Inside, the cellist began to play. He was a world-renowned performer, his technique flawless, his tone like rich honey. She could hear the beautiful, complex music drifting out. It was magnificent. And the audience, she could tell, was listening with polite appreciation. But the spell, her spell, was over. They were back in the world of performance. She had given them 3 minutes of shared humanity. Now they were back to being spectators. She didn't mind. That wasn't her world either. Not really. She had touched her own world, and for a moment allowed others to see it. That was enough. More than enough. She stayed out there until the shaking stopped and the cold began to bite through to her bones. When she slipped back inside, the concert was nearing its end. She avoided everyone, weaving through the now quieter backstage area, and collected her coat from the makeshift closet. She left before the final bows, before the champagne reception, before anyone could find her. She didn't want praise or questions. The thing that had happened was complete. Talking about it would only shrink it. The next morning, she woke up at her usual time. The gray light in her apartment was the same. The quiet was the same. For a moment, lying in bed, she wondered if it had all been a dream. Had she really played? Had they really stood? Then she saw her black dress draped over the chair, and she knew it was real. A different kind of quiet filled her now. Not the quiet of waiting, but the quiet after a truth has been spoken. It was a peaceful quiet. She made her tea. She sat at her small kitchen table, and she did not think about the director, or the audience, or the next gala. She thought about the ghost in the notes. That ghost was hers. It had always been hers. It wasn't just in that one piece of simple music. It was in her. It was her voice. For 10 years, her job had been to play the music of others. To be a conduit. She had been a mirror, reflecting the intentions of composers and the demands of teachers. Now, for the first time, she felt a pull to be a source. A small, quiet source. After her tea, she didn't go to the school. Instead, she went to a small, dusty music shop in a part of town the gala patrons never visited. She bought a fresh, empty notebook of manuscript paper. The pages were blank, a field of endless parallel lines waiting for marks. She brought it home. She sat at her own piano, the one that knew her best. She opened the notebook to the first page. She picked up a pencil, and she hesitated. The ghost had no name. The feelings from last night had no melody yet. but they had a shape of longing, of memory, of gray light and golden leaves, of silent years and a single, resonant chord that refused to be forgotten. She put the pencil to the paper. She drew a simple treble clef. Then, tentatively, she began to place a few notes on the staff. They weren't grand or impressive. They were a simple, searching phrase. It wasn't Souvenir d'Automne. It was something new. It was hers. She was composing. Down at the school, the day moved on. The young prodigies practiced with fiery ambition. The director sat in his office, the events of the previous night replaying in his mind. He had a stack of messages. A critic from a major paper wanted the name of the interlude pianist. A wealthy donor asked if she taught private lessons. The director looked at the closed door, thinking of the fire escape, the empty corridor where she had vanished. He realized he didn't know the first thing about her. Not really. He knew her reliability. He knew her skill. He did not know the woman who had found a universe in a piece of nothing special. He felt a sharp regret. Not for the delayed changeover, but for the 10 years of not seeing what was right in front of him. He would call her. He would offer something a featured spot next year, a raise, a title. But even as he thought it, he knew it was too late, and it was the wrong thing. You couldn't offer a spotlight to someone who had found their own sun dot at her kitchen table. She finished the first phrase of her own music. It was rough. It was just a beginning. She played it on the piano, her fingers finding the unfamiliar sequence. It sounded hesitant. It sounded alive. She looked out the window at the gray sky. It was the same color as yesterday and the day before that. But it looked different now. It wasn't the light that surrounds a ghost. It was just light. And she was no longer in the background. She was here, in the center of her own life, listening and finally beginning to speak.